RSA 2020. Day 2, I guess, Wednesday. Hopefully people aren't too hungover. This marks year 20 for me here at the conference, so good 2 decades worth of time. My name's Aaron Turner, and I focus on the mobile and IoT track here. I'm actually one of the RSA program committee members, and I'm joined by...
I'm Georgia Weedman, and I don't think my mic is on. Is it?
Keep going.
Hello?
There you
Okay,
go.
now
Yep.
I'm on.
Yep.
Cool. I guess I should have tested that. Anyway, so I'm Georgia Weedman, and I'm the founder of Shavira, and I also do mobile and IoT, though this is actually my first time speaking here at RSA. Thanks, Aaron. And yeah, we're going to do some mobile and IoT stuff, I guess.
Yeah. So when we put together this session, really the main thing that we wanted to drive towards is all these people are starting to use a mobile device as a second factor of authentication. So we have this situation where we've moved from usernames and passwords to usernames, passwords, and a token that people would use. We're going to walk through a little bit of the history and the background, and then we're going to show you some of the real bad risks that people are taking, and they may not be doing that. So I'll go ahead and get started in the presentation here, give you an overview. So a bit of history about how we got here, a little bit about the numbers of why this is a problem, recent enterprise incidents that we've had to help clean up regarding mobile MFA, how hard is it to compromise this, and that is where Georgia is going to show off a live demo of just how easy it is to take over mobile multi-factor. And then hopefully offer you some action plans, like how do you go about solving these things. So I was a very young software tester at Microsoft in the late 1990s. And I pulled the short straw on the software testing team where I had to test all of the multi-factor integrations with Windows NT 4. Let's just say that the blue screen rates were very, very high because back in those days, if you wanted to do MFA, the only way you could do it is you had to replace the Gina, which was the security handler in the OS, and you had to replace it with the vendor's Gina, right? Yeah, kind of a bad architecture here. So needless to say, I spent a lot of time in crash dump analysis and debuggers and that sort of thing, trying to figure out why wouldn't these multi-factor things work. So if we look about this, random number generators back in the late 90s, that's where the RSA stuff came out. You had the key fobs. With Windows NT 3.5.1 was actually the first full integration of the smart card, where you could use plug-in smart cards as a hardware separation. And that was the genesis of what became the CAC and the PIV card that was eventually used by the US government. Now, if we take a look at today, Google's Beyond Corp initiative has shown us how far it's come, where now we have these cool little YubiKeys that give us a hardware-separated token that can allow us to do much better multi-factor authentication. So from the days of blue screening to the days of YubiKey, we've come quite a long way. So you say, well, actually, things are a good situation, right? Well, actually, not so great of a situation. So let's take a look at the early 2000s. So basically back in those days, security-related help desk incidents increased by 5,000% in one company when they went to MFA. Right? So MFA was a really good way to drive help desk incidents inside of a company. And then if we take a look at another situation in 2011, Lockheed Martin had all of their stuff stolen, all of their intellectual property stolen, because RSA was attacked and Lockheed Martin was trusting the RSA keys, and so lots of bad stuff happened as the result there. So then we look at a situation and say, well, surely if we use an SMS one-time use code, we can fix these problems, right? We can send a one-time use code to people and they'll take care of it. Well, in 2017, there was a 40 million euro hack over the course of 30 days where bad guys got onto the back end of the SS7 network, scraped the SMS one-time use codes for a German banking system for fun and profit, right? So these are situations where it shows you the weaknesses of these other ones. Now, if we think about 2019, last year was the largest year where I have had to clean up incidents regarding multi-factor authentication in my career. So I've been doing this for 25 years. And so that should serve as an indicator to say, yeah, we haven't figured this out yet. So if we think about 2019, what happened? What could possibly go wrong if we install a user mode application with sensitive cryptographic key material inside of a user mode application sitting on a platform where you have no visibility into what's happening at the kernel? Well, bad things happen. Incident number one, we had a person who they were running IaaS, so infrastructure as a service and software as a service. They were an admin. They had their multi-factor token on their application. Attackers stole the information to become him, both his username and password, as well as a mobile MFA, and basically proceeded to cause destruction and problems on the infrastructure as a service backend. Another incident, we saw an attacker who gained access to the corporate VPN platform by cloning a mobile MFA token. And then we also saw an attacker gaining access to a privileged access management platform by cloning the mobile MFA token, right? So we see situations where it's impacting infrastructure as a service, it's impacting corporate VPN, it's impacting PAM platforms. I would safely say that this is probably impacting everything. So Georgia, tell me a little bit about your perspective on this. What happens when you install an application inside of iOS or Android? Like, where does that stuff sit?
It sits at the user level, kind of about as high as you can get up on the stack.
So if you look at this here, explain this diagram to the folks in the audience.
So basically, Aaron has a lot of examples of MFA applications. Certainly, that's not all of them, and these aren't necessarily the ones that are in the demo. But they're all sitting in user land at the application level, and you see like the kernel and stuff all down there red. So if the attacker is able to get like farther down, like embedded into the operating system, you've probably heard of like rooting and jailbreaking, like doing that for bad, not to get third-party app stores, but to get control of the device. Then you can see everything at user level. You can actually even maybe just dump the memory, get into like the keychain or other secure storage, look at anything they have stored just on the file system. Really anything that's on the device or the device is doing, you might be able to get access to it. Well, I say you might. You will be able to get access to it.
So if I get a kernel mode hook here, and can I then imitate the application and gain access to its keys?
Oh, absolutely, yes. You can gain access to anything the application does at that point. I mean, even if it's encrypted, it has to unencrypt itself, like to show it like the data on the screen. You can just get into the memory. So worst case, if they're doing a really good job, then you might have to do memory dumping. More likely, they've just put it in the keychain or storing it like in their local storage on the operating system, which you can see all that.
So how hard is it for me to clean up my mess if I'm the attacker? So let's say I use one of these exploits and I gain access to it and I steal the keys to these authenticators. What do I do do I leave behind any forensic evidence if I do that?
Well, it depends on the sophistication of the attacker, like how much forensics evidence. In a lot of cases, the jailbreaks are, what you'd call semi-tethered or tethered. So when you restart the operating system, it like goes back to normal. So like worst case, once they restart, as long as you don't just leave things lying around. I mean, you can be very stealthy at this. You could have no indication that this ever happened. It's not like, good attackers don't install third-party app stores like Cydia. A lot of your defense mechanisms will look, are you jailbroken? They'll look for like the super user app, or they'll look for Cydia, which if you're jailbreaking or rooting your own device because you want additional privileges, absolutely, you'll probably have that. But if I'm an attacker and I just want to steal like your multi-factor authentication keys, I don't need a third-party app store. I just need like a dynamic library that I can then delete. So those checks are going to probably miss this stuff.
So from my own experience, when I've been called in to help clean up these messes, people have basically come to us and said, look, we see the abuse of a multi-factor token on our systems. We've gone in, we've tried to find forensic evidence of what happened, and we haven't found any. Because what in my experience and in my opinion, what's happening is the bad guys get their kernel hook, they clone the information they need, they bring that off to their attack platform, and all they have to do is cause the user to reboot their device, and at that point, I'm done, right?
Right.
There's nothing left.
So you can just, delete anything that you drop in the file system, and even if you don't delete it, if it's it'll reboot into its trusted platform, it'll delete anything you put there anyway. It's like anti-forensics not needed even.
Yeah. So now, a lot of times when I bring this up to people, they bring up the fact of saying, well, the iOS has this secure enclave, and Android has these secure elements, and these are these super hardware-enabled cryptographic platforms. Does that do any good if you've got a kernel vulnerability you can operate?
I mean, for things like, Apple Wallet, I mean, that does give you some additional, like, security. I mean, that would be, like, extra stuff you have to deal with. But, those user land applications, they're not using that anyway. You have to be special to get to use Secure Enclave, because if they just let stuff like that in, it wouldn't be Secure Enclave anymore. It would be user land of the phone. So that doesn't even come into play here. But, I mean, there have been attacks that have gotten into the Secure Enclave. So, but that is...
And if we think about that, so at one point I was doing some research with an organization, and one of the vendors claimed that the user mode application relied on the Secure Enclave to generate the random numbers, which then served as a security mechanism. But that's a one-time use of the Secure Enclave to generate random numbers, right?
Right.
The rest of the keys are then stored in the keychain, right?
Right. I mean, if you're using it for random number generation, yeah, if that just makes the key, you're putting it, again, best case probably in the keychain, which is, I mean, if you sit it off the phone, then you've got cloud problems. So there really is no good place to put your keys.
Yep. So now, if we think about this, how big of a problem is this? Like, how easy is it to find these remote exploits?
Well, I'm not going to say it's easy. I mean, it does take, like, knowledge of the latest and greatest in terms of exploitation. These devices are, doing, anti-exploitation as well as a device can in our current, atmosphere, if you will. But there are, I mean, the bad guys have people who that's their whole job. The good guys have people that's their whole job, people that are in security research, spend all their time looking for vulnerabilities. And we see, from this graph, they do come up from time to time, as they do with all platforms. We're certainly not saying, Android and iOS are bad, don't use them. Certainly there's going to be security issues in anything, but I think the vendors especially are like, this is so secure, no one will ever break into it, but we do see that vulnerabilities do come up from time to time.
So if I'm reading these graphs correctly, right? So in iOS vulnerabilities, I take a look down here and I see 778 remote code execution vulnerabilities on iOS and 534 remote code execution vulnerabilities on Android. This kind of blows up one of the perceptions that we see in the market, right? I mean,
right. I mean, not all of those are you going to find like public code that you can use. Not all of those are going to be reliable. Not all of those are going to get you like the level of access you may need, but you only need one. You don't need, 700 of them. So some subset of that you'll probably be able to use, if you're a bad guy and you want to start taking over phones and stealing things, you can probably find something in that list that you're able to use to get what you want.
So, from your experience, if someone came to you and said, I've got a fleet of devices running iOS and I've got a fleet of devices running Android, and if they've got good Android hygiene and equally good iOS hygiene, which is the more difficult platform to get stuff out of?
Actually, this has changed in the last couple of years. It used to be, iOS was always the more secure one. Android was always kind of the security joke. But over time, this has kind of switched. iOS is still good, believe me. But Android, Secure Enclave, SE Linux, Secure Enclave is an iOS. SE Linux for Android is the bane of my existence as somebody who's building exploits. It's gotten quite good. Also, with iOS, pretty much, you get an iOS, you've got an iOS. They're all pretty much, the same. Android, it's so open, you can make an Android microwave. Really, you can. It's still technically Android as long as it meets a few standards. So you can build whatever you want. The hardware is going to be different. The software is going to be tweaked differently. So, if you have a lot of different Androids in your organization, which you probably do, getting an exploit where I can hit all of them is going to be all but impossible. So I'm going to have to do a lot more work like for each one. Whereas with the iPhone, it's like, oh, I can hit anything, iOS 13 and lower even. So Android's actually harder.
And also from my perspective, when my organization gets asked to perform pen tests, if they want pen tests against a fully patched Android Pixel device, we charge 3 times as much as we charge for iOS pen tests because it's just a lot harder. Yeah. So I think this is one of the things that and with all things in security, it's a pendulum, right? It's something that when iOS first came out, it was here, but now the pendulum has swung, and fully updated Android is actually much more difficult to go after in our experience. So what we did to show just how easy it is to do this, there are 17 active repositories where you can go and for free go to GitHub and you can get active exploits that will help you do the things that George is going to show you here today. and 19 repositories for Android. Now, one of the things that's critical to remember about this is that the patch race, the software security race that has existed on Windows since the advent of Patch Tuesday, essentially, if you think back in the early 2000s, when Microsoft would release its security updates on that Tuesday, you essentially had 4 weeks until the bad guys had reverse engineered that patch and then optimized that code to be able to make it an exploit. So you have this period of time before exploits were commoditized. Well, today in mobile, we have that same problem. So basically, when Apple or Google release their security updates, generally on a monthly basis, you essentially have 4 weeks to get your phones updated, right? So you have that same cycle that you have to think about. And so what we've seen is that once Apple or Google releases the update, it's about 4 weeks until you see the GitHub exploits that are available for free download, or you see the Project Zero stuff that's done on responsible disclosure, right? So let's show what we're going to do, right? So let's go ahead and if we can switch over to the demo machine. So why don't you walk us through what you're going to show us?
Okay, so this is, my little testing platform where I mess with phones and IoT. Don't want to get too close to that mic, I don't think. So what I'm going to do actually here is basically show you nothing, because when attackers do something, you don't actually see anything. So I've got an iPhone here. There's an Android in my bag that's actually also attached to this. So what I'm going to do is show you actually stealing MFA keys without letting the user know what's going on. This does require there to be an app on the device. What people don't realize is that mobile is a great place to do phishing and social engineering. There are tons of ways to get people to download stuff. Think about any way you can give somebody like a link in any way. You've got text message, QR codes are great. I love getting people to scan QR codes. Near field communication, Bluetooth, all those messaging apps, your WhatsApp, Twitter, Facebook Messenger, Snapchat, any way that you can get somebody to talk to a link and download something. And this works on iOS as well. We were like, it's got to go through the App Store. The jailbreakers keep getting enterprise development certificates where the user just has to say, do you trust the certificate? Absolutely. If you guys have mobile device management or enterprise mobility management, you're used to doing this. You have to trust your enterprise's certificate, so users are used to saying yes. So your bad guys are going to be able to get valid developer profiles. They keep doing it. I'm not sure why Apple keeps saying yes, but that's their problem, I guess. And so, since we're in Moscone Center at RSA, you'll forgive me if I'm not gonna wait for a text message to come in, because we could be here all day. But just think of all the ways you might be able to get somebody to install an app. So people saying you have to have local privilege escalation is not a deal breaker by any means. But anyway, the devices, the people install it, the apps do. You can actually embed this in existing apps. I did one with a reference customer. I can talk about it. They were in DC. They shared a building with a restaurant. I put in their break room a little poster with QR code, said download this app for the restaurant, and next time you come in, we'll give you a discount. They shared the building. Naturally, they went there. They were downloading it. It looked and felt like the real app, because it was. I just embedded, a little extra in there, so it would call home to me. This is exactly what the bad guys are doing, except I do it to help you. So anyway, the apps call home, as one does. So this would be off in the cloud somewhere, and it would call home as any embedded thing would. And then, I can just push buttons and tell it, what I want it to do. And I do have the phone here. That's my horse. But yeah, I have the phone mirrored on here. That's the app. It just says Shavira, but, it's just a phone. And then, you've got somebody who install the app calls home. And then the user can just use their phone as normal. And we can, for instance, Aaron mentioned two-factor SMS messages. Certainly, I did, as far back as 2011, I did SMS botnets where you would sit at the modem level and intercept text messages, so you can get it before the user ever does, or keep the user from getting it, or you could just ask it what's the SMS database. and have it like grab the SMS database.
And even on iOS, you could sit at the iMessage level and essentially intercept and delete iMessages as well, right?
Absolutely.
So this isn't just, this is any OTT communication.
Right. And then, like I mentioned, we need to root the device. Something like to get full access to the keychain on iOS, I do need to root it. Basically, keychains are set up so you have like an access group, and you can only be in like, your access groups. You can't see everything because security. But if you do jailbreak, if you do an exploit and get full access, then basically you can just put yourself as a star, and then you have access to everything, and you can just say, query, select all, everything I have access to, and pull down like the entire.
So that would give you access to all of the secrets on the device.
Right, exactly. That would let you pull the entire keychain. So I'm just pushing buttons, and like if I say like get the MFAs, and like nothing happens over here. Like when Aaron's like, you're gonna show them what it does, right? And I'm like, but it doesn't do anything because the user doesn't see anything. All the user has to do is install an app, or in some cases browse to a certain site where it hits like their WebKit to get on the device. I mean, it just depends on the exploit, but most exploits that people are using on iOS and Android are going to be local privilege escalation, so you are going to have to do some sort of phishing or something. But like I said, that's not a deal breaker. It is rife with phishing possibilities. So like if I look at like my root, it says, you got root, yay, lucky you. Text messages, it says this is your one-time code. It's just, these are test phones. Nothing interesting there. Like the keys, so that's like the entire keychain dumped. It's not very pretty, but I had it just grab the MFAs. I redacted the application. You may have seen some applications on there. There's many applications on there. I will not tell you exactly which app this is. I may do a Black Hat talk or something where I go into the technical details. Who knows? But then this is just like I think it's elliptic curve key because it's 160 bits. This particular app, it has the key and it takes the secret token and the time, runs a little algorithm, and that gives you the code. So having this, and the time, you can do the same thing. Take the app and reverse engineer it, find out what their algorithm is, and you can make the same thing. So right, just having that key.
So let's walk through this, okay? I copy this key, right? I bring that back to an attack device that's
so
under my control.
I have it on my machine now, yeah.
Right? And as long as my time is synchronized, right?
Right, which I could also ask it, what time is it on the device if I wanted to.
Yep, and so basically this is all that's standing between people who use mobile MFA and the bad guys, is this token, right? It's not protected in any way because it is installed in user mode memory.
Well, it's on the keychain of the device.
Accessible via user mode memory, right? Because that user mode app has to place it into the keychain.
Right, it places it in the keychain, but it puts it in its security group. So when I, go down to root level and I'm in the kernel, I can then give myself the entitlement, as they call it in iOS, to be a star, so I can see all of the keychain. They won't I can't build that in Xcode just regularly. It'll be like, no, you can't do that. You have to be in security groups. You can't say you're all security groups. You're not the phone. But now I am the phone, so I can be in all the groups, so I can see everything. Anything anybody puts on the keychain, I now have access to because I'm below that user level. Now I can do what I want.
So let's talk about a case that I was involved in. A global administrator for Office 365 was traveling. He was rocking an iPhone 4, okay? Mm-hmm. So roughly, how many remote exploits could you get on an iPhone 4 today?
Well, anything that old is going to be 32-bit, and they're not updating them anymore. So I can guarantee you I can get anything that old until they switched to 64-bit. They stopped updating anything that old. So if you have one that old, you need to get a new one because they're not updating. You're in Android realm now. They always said about Android, they don't get updated. The older iPhone devices don't get updated anymore. So I can definitely hit them.
All right, so this global administrator for Office 365 had an iPhone 4, and he was using Microsoft Authenticator to be able to get onto the Office 365 backend. So basically, all the person had to do was to get a commodity iPhone exploit and go after it, and they copied that token and they had him, right?
Right.
So I think, and to put this situation into real world terms, what happened in this case was he was traveling to a high-risk country, high-risk country targeted him, cloned his stuff, and then when he left the country, continued to use his credentials to do all sorts of interesting things, like turn on the Exchange Online forensic dump for the CEO's email, gather all of the CFO's OneDrive accounts. All sorts of bad things happened as the result of this. And so this is, in my opinion, the real, if I think about the toxic Venn diagram of what's happening right now, is non-hygienic use of mobile MFA and cloud services that are relying on that MFA, and now you don't really know who's on the back end, right? You don't know who's getting that stuff. All right, anything else you want to show us?
Not particularly.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. I mean, what's nice, and George is kind of modest, that what she was just demonstrating there is a platform called Shavira that she's developed. And it's an automated exploit tool that helps mere mortals be able to automate this stuff.
So you can find your vulnerabilities and fix them, not so you can steal people's stuff. That's bad.
Clarify, yeah, asterisk, meant for the good guys. So if we think about this impact on the market, okay, so through ION's research, I work with about 200 global enterprises where we conduct interviews and consulting engagements and just kind of ask them, what's actually happening? And we believe that in ION's research customers, about 40% of devices in the Fortune 500, they have mobile fleets that have not had their OS updates installed within 6 weeks. So remember the last stat I gave you is you have 4 weeks to patch? Well, here's 6 weeks. So in my opinion, roughly 40% of all mobile devices connected to enterprises around the world are vulnerable to these attacks today. Now, the more worrying statistic is, in that same research, we see 90% of global enterprises using mobile MFA today. Right? So these are folks who are now relying on a Duo or an Okta or a Microsoft Authenticator or something like that. So if I were to put those numbers together, it's my estimate today that there's more than 5 million vulnerable mobile devices that have MFA installed on it that are connected to enterprises today. Now, if you think that we've got problems in solving vulnerabilities with our laptops and desktops and servers, this is a whole order of magnitude bigger. So if I think about really the impact of the industry, I think this is something that we've got to start paying attention to at a much larger scale. So if we think about relying on MFA, what would you recommend?
Well, I mean, we're certainly not saying don't do it, because two-factor is better than one. It's certainly better than, just having a password. But I mean, with anything, I think that in terms of preventative controls, you get, when the vendors come in, I know this is a vendor conference, but when the vendors come in, they say, you use this and everything will be perfect. You don't have to worry about things like security, hygiene anymore, which is how people with big budgets get popped, let's be honest. So, I mean, I think use stuff like this, but keep up with, password management, patch management, social engineering, training, all the stuff you need to be doing to have a good security program. This is just one little piece. It's not going to save you in and of itself. And, take into account, I think a lot of people are like, iPhone is secure. We don't have to worry about stuff that's on there. That's fine. Do take into account that, your phones might get hit. Your MFA might get hit. What kind of, what would that do to your enterprise? Would it be a huge deal? It sounds like for that one you talked about, that would be kind of a big deal. And limit your risk. Do impact analysis. Do something, like what I've showed. What happens? Do a real phone in your enterprise. Somebody gets on it. Somebody steals the MFA. What are they able to get to? What is the impact on your organization? So I think, be proactive about, what might happen to your enterprise and, what these things actually buy you in terms of security. It's not a panacea at all.
And to add to what Georgia just said, this should become part of your red teaming efforts, right? For those of you who have, insight into your red teaming programs, basically popping a mobile MFA should be part of your red team, because it is remarkably difficult to figure out what has happened when mobile MFA has been compromised. So for example, most of the leading platforms today that do mobile MFA for you don't have the telemetry on the back end to tell you if a device is being cloned. because they basically trust that that token is on that device. There's no way to say, well, wait a second, I see this from 2 different IP addresses. The reason why that's a false positive on most platforms is because you assume that people are roaming between a cellular network and a Wi-Fi network, and so it doesn't look for multiple IP addresses with the same key, because it would create so many false positives. And so the platforms themselves have made it very difficult to detect these things. And so if people ask me, hey, Aaron, what do you do? Right? If you're advising someone about how to really solve this risk, it really comes down to discipline. Right? You've got to have the disciplined conversation around policy to say it's not okay for an iPhone prior to an 8 to connect to our enterprise stuff. Sorry, right? I don't want to inherit the risks associated with 32-bit iPhone platforms. I need to have better discipline. So in our research, we basically have shown that if you've got an iPhone 8, you've got the 64-bit processor that can consume the iOS updates today, and then, but there's still a gap in that recommendation there. There are hardware-based vulnerabilities that the iPhones prior to the XS are vulnerable to. So if you're dealing with high-value individuals, CEOs, CFOs, named executives, that sort of thing, you need to get them on XSs or later, because there's hardware vulns on 10s and prior that can't be fixed. It's a class of vulnerability known as checkmate. And so I think that's how you get your discipline around iOS. When it comes to the Android world, in my opinion, you should not use any other device in the Android world except for the Pixel class of devices. There's just, well, not to badmouth a particular vendor, Georgia, but do you think that fancy things like Samsung Knox are helpful when it comes to kernel mode vulnerabilities?
Helpful, yes, but deal breaker, no. I mean, at best, it's one extra step. I find Secure Linux to be more of a headache than Samsung Knox, but that's just me.
So what I tell people is, look, if resources are limited and you can't afford to carpet bomb your enterprise in the Android world with a Pixel class device, then the best thing to do is to go to an Android One. Android One is a class of devices that Google has worked with their OEM partners to create essentially a pure play flavor of Android that doesn't have the keyboard bloatware and the other crap that the OEMs install. And in my opinion, I've had good experience with both Motorola and the Nokia, oddly enough, Nokia still makes phones, class of Android One devices that actually have a very good rhythm of supplying the Android updates at a fairly low price. I was working with one customer who replaced 60,000 Android devices in 1 year with phones that they could get for $110 a piece. And those were phones that could be maintained and had a decent lifetime on them. So it doesn't require breaking the bank. If you have to go after this, you can apply good security hygiene at a low cost. Now, one thing I will say, Karsten Knoll, who is a great researcher from Germany, last year published a paper about how Samsung was actually fraudulently updating their devices by not delivering the binaries. So they would essentially increment the version on the screen, but they wouldn't deliver the binaries to fix the problems, right? That's a problem, right? And they need to be held accountable for that. And so the way that we hold them accountable is stop buying their stuff, right? Get onto platforms that are sustainable when it comes to security perspective. So now, the only way that I've found to actually get this done is you have to hold enterprise email hostage. So basically, you become the enterprise email terrorist, okay? And you basically say, hey, you want access to enterprise email? You got to hold to my discipline. You got to be patched. You're not patched. You're not updated. Sorry, I'm not going to let you read your email. And this is especially important because people need to realize that this is an enterprise credential problem, right? So once you talk to the auditors, well, I'll pose the question to you, Georgia. What would most IT security auditors tell you if you told someone that they had lost 40% of their enterprise credentials?
Bad?
Yeah. That's usually a material finding.
Have a nice find.
And so if you have trouble getting this discipline, go cozy up to the IT auditors and say, hey, I think we've lost positive control of 40% of our enterprise creds. I don't know you go fix that, right? And it's that sort of stuff that helps us as security people say, okay, we need to do something about it. We've got to make an investment to help solve this problem. And this is especially important as I mentioned before, because of the reliance on cloud now. Most people who use cloud platforms, they don't understand how many people are tickling those creds, right? It's somewhere up there in Office 365.
You have all these other people who might be forgetting to patch, who
Yeah.
now have access to your stuff.
Yeah, and so it becomes critical to move that way. So I think, now luckily that we've made it through our demos and our presentation a little bit early, so we've got plenty of time for Q&A. I've got just a couple of points that I'll use to wrap up, but we've got plenty of time. So if you have a question you'd like to ask, please approach the microphone, speak loudly into the microphone. We're happy to take your questions, so please step up.
Got to measure 6.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
So all of this is really interesting. It kind of supports my thought that the weakest link in the entire security life cycle is sitting in this room, every single one of us. So given that, there's another angle on MFA, particularly mobile MFA, that interests me that I didn't see you address. Something that annoys me is that they've broken the authenticators or the authentication elements out, right? Typically you'll go username, password, and then there'll be some twang to the phone. And 201, all of the systems I've seen to date, as soon as you put the password in and it's wrong, it goes, sorry, you got that wrong. And we're breaking a basic rule of authentication, which is tell the attackers how well they're doing in attacking us. And how do you feel about that as a risk in addition to this? Because I think it gets magnified by mobile MFA.
So I'll go first, then Georgia can take it up. So in my opinion, the use of usernames and passwords is so broken inherently in and of itself that essentially it starts to become that channel through which people can start to know how successful they are, right? And so in my opinion, we should be moving towards passwordless and using more types of additional information. So for example, one research project I'm working on right now is instead of a username and password, it does a mesh network scan to see who you're next to and actually ask that guy, is that guy really there, right? So you're starting to use additional factors rather than a username and a password. It's more about where you're at, who you're with, these additional things like that. And so I think we can do better by applying technology to this to get away from usernames and passwords. So anything you want to add to that?
Well, yeah, I mean, in addition to that, I mean, absolutely we should be moving towards that, but I mean, I agree with you that, anytime if I put in like a dummy password, it should, send the text message or ask me for the authentication, and it should log it like on the back end so that like that's happening. So, if you're getting, say, the text message, you can see somebody's trying to access your account because you're getting the message. So, if they're not doing that, they absolutely should be doing that. The authenticator should be like, okay, it asked me for something. So you have all that if there are bad ones.
And what George is talking about there is dual delivery formats, right? Where it's not just trusting one channel, because if she's intercepting the SMS message at the kernel, right, is it also being delivered through email in other ways so the user can gain knowledge to go, oh crap, I didn't get that SMS password. Oh crap, I've got a compromised platform.
Yeah, like how Google does it. Said, did you sign in from Romania? Like something like that would be very helpful, yes.
Yeah.
But to pivot you've hit something that annoys me. Everybody wants to move towards passwordless. And the problem I see with that is the one way we know that the person who should be participating is we have a demonstration that this was somehow engaged. And to me, I don't care if you call it a password, a PIN, it's an expression of a cognitive decision on the part of the user to participate. Yeah. And I think, especially in high value transactions, that always needs to be demonstrated at some point in time. Maybe not every time, and then you use these additional factors you're talking about to kind of validate that that person's still in proximity to the things they were in 10 minutes ago.
Well, I think the point you're driving at there is we still need to have consent, right? There needs to be active consent, because for me it's not necessarily is knowledge engaged, right? Because sometimes knowledge can be spoofed, but is someone consenting? Right. So,
but you have to demonstrate that it was actually this brain that consented,
right, and not someone else
over there.
Right, yeah. But I steal passwords all the time for good. But yeah.
I understand. It's not a perfect system, but it's.
So we've got a bunch of other questions here. Let's follow up afterwards, though, if we have more. So let's go here and then here.
Sure. Question on. and I think I know the answer to this, but is there having the work profile, for example, on an Android device or an iPhone device, does that help at all in any of this?
So, Georgia, how well has MDM, MAM, and work profile stood up to our testing in the past?
Yeah, we did that one, didn't we? It's, again, it's like at best another step. I mean, if you're at, I mean, the idea about that is that they're like in different user spaces. If you're at kernel space, you can see both of them. So
Georgia's way too nice. They're useless, okay?
Okay.
Patch the device, okay?
I mean,
I kind of figured, but
they
I'd
give
ask.
you access to your enterprise email without having to go to a help desk.
Yeah, patch the device,
Now,
right?
yeah, agreed. But how about the YubiKeys if you're on a desktop or using it with near field?
Yeah, so hardware separation is your friend,
Yeah.
right? At that point, you don't suffer from the software vulnerabilities. People ask me, hey, Aaron, what do you do? I've got 2 YubiKeys in my wallet, right? I have 2 separate identities that I can control, and I've got that hardware separation. So thanks for your question. Here.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you could contrast for us the concerns that you have up here together with the use of a corporate BYOD program.
Okay. How about you first, Georgia? What do you think about BYOD?
Necessary evil. Definitely BYOD is here to stay. But what I don't see people doing with BYOD is having it as part of their like security assessment and auditing program. So many people are, oh, that's that. Oh, we can't test people's phones. Same thing that Aaron said, don't let them have their corporate email unless, they're updating. Don't let them have their corporate email unless they check a box that consents, to be part of the assessment. So I think, that would help a lot. But I mean, as Aaron mentioned with like the Androids and then the older iPhones, as soon as you start seeing those come into play, there has to be policies around what's allowed and what's not. It can't just be like, oh, here's the IoT coffee machine I got over the weekend kind of deal. And older phones that aren't getting their updates. And I mean, that Samsung stuff from Karsten is frightening because, we can never believe version numbers, but I'd like to think we can at least believe them if they come directly like from the device. But
Yeah.
oh,
So
well.
from my perspective, it doesn't matter who owns the device. What's the configuration?
Yeah.
Right? And so if you've got good discipline around configuration, bring your own device. I don't care. As long as it meets my principles and my discipline, got it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Let's go here and then back.
Okay, so this may be from an attacker's perspective. So you mentioned that for phishing, you require an app on the device. So how hard is it for like your application signing requirements on various devices for a phishing app to be installed? And so does it like help at all that there are signing requirements for that?
I mean, it certainly helps. But it's not a deal breaker. The bad guys keep getting like legitimate enterprise profiles. You see it, with every jailbreak app. If you guys ever jailbreak, they always say, "Do you accept our certificate?" That's like Apple's certificate that they're giving out for enterprise development. So things like mobile device management, enterprise mobility management can throw apps at you, which is great. It is a good extra requirement. I mean, if you take it like against Windows, where it's like, oh, let's just download this nonsense online game, just say yes. I mean, having that extra step in there, but especially because people are used to saying yes to certificates from things like mobile device management, I haven't really seen it stop many people.
And one thing to add to that is that in the demonstration she showed, it does require an app, but the older the device, the less likely you need them to install an app. So let's take a look at what happened to Jeff Bezos that was published and publicized in the last couple months, right? That required no app, right? It was an MPEG video delivered through WhatsApp. The 0-day was installed inside of the MPEG video, took over, rooted the device, stole all of his creds, and he didn't have to install an app, right? Mm-hmm. So the older the device, the less likely that you're going to have them install an app to deal with the cert problem.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Thanks for your question. Back here.
Hey. Well, thank you, first of all, for the great information so far.
Glad to do it.
So, obviously you gave us some hygiene things to do with the devices, what devices to use, what not to, what links not to click. a lot of organizations, obviously because of BYO, cannot dictate very easily which devices users bring in. But maybe, do you think the use of technologies like the MTDs or EDRs on the devices, likes of like mobile threat defense or endpoint detection, remediation, I've seen their live demos, and like those profiles, the certificates that you mentioned that are, scanning a barcode, getting trusted, install it, they do seem to detect some of those, if not all. They also claim to have behavioral, crowdsourcing knowledge that, hey, we saw this 0 days somewhere else, so we'll alert you. Some of that. So are they really useful, or to what extent, if at all?
So Georgia, have any of those things ever stopped us?
None of those things have ever stopped us. However, for a very long time, I saw pretty much everything in the mobile, like, preventative technology world as pretty much, nothing, snake oil, basically scanned whether it was a virus and then went to sleep. I will say that, in the last, couple years, about the time they made the new category of mobile threat defense, I think, some of these vendors are really starting to think about these problems and say, instead of just looking for the Cydia app to see jailbroken, they might say, oh, the file system just went read-write. It's not supposed to be, and it would flag that as jailbroken. So I think they are moving the right direction. Are they going to stop the sophisticated attackers? Absolutely not. They have either bought or pirated a copy of that, and they make sure their attacks get through before they ever send it to a real victim. But they are, they are going to catch a lot of the, like, things that my mom downloads from her online games, kind of thing.
It'll stop the stupid stuff, okay? Right. And that's where it does. But for example, on the last engagement George and I worked on together, she downloaded a GitHub exploit, didn't change it at all, threw it against these MTDs, and none of them caught it.
I changed it a little bit.
Well, okay, but it wasn't. Did it take a ton of time?
No.
It was a fairly simple thing. So here's where I think there's value in that ecosystem. I just met with the CTO of one of the MTDs this week here to provide this level of feedback to them. I'm not here to burn their house down, right? I think there is value in what they're trying to do. The best value is when you can get the MTD loaded at the kernel level to watch what's happening at the kernel, right? And the only way that happens is with a device partnership, and that's only in the Android ecosystem. You can't do that with iOS.
Come pre-installed from stock Android.
OEM image. Yeah. OEM integrated MTD has some value, right? Because at that point, you're watching for the low-level stuff.
So MFA, instead of that, if biometrics were to be used, or some kind of other, like what I am rather than what I possess or what I know.
So I'll take this first and then hand it to Georgia. So my problem with biometrics is that first off, I am fundamentally opposed to the use of biometrics for authentication because it is non-revocable. So if we think about the rules of authentication and authorization, you only want to use a revocable credential, right? So there's a really good case study from 2005. Mercedes-Benz put thumbprint readers on their car doors of their S-Class, and they implemented in Southeast Asia to start. 15 people lost their thumbs, right? So when you attach value to a body part, the body part will be separated. It's not a matter of if or when, it will happen. And so now let's move into biometrics as we think about it now on these mobile devices. So on iOS and Android devices, those aren't really biometrics readers. They don't have proof of life. They are not true like scanners that give you the ability. They're essentially biometric toys, right? They're these playthings that allow you to replace a PIN or a password with a touch of a finger, but you don't really know if it's a finger. It could be a cat paw or a whatever, right? And so in my opinion, there is still value there. So if you look at the entropy that's derived from a fingerprint, it's still greater than a 4-digit PIN. So okay, that's great. But that's not, in my opinion, that's not biometrics. So what do you think, Georgia?
Well, I mean, I guess I would put it in the same category of, it's better than nothing. So, I mean, use it in addition to, but, like you say, it's not, I mean, if you just look at the researchers are always like, oh, somebody touched this thing with dirty hands, and then I put it in front of the reader, and then it worked, or, I did it while my parents were asleep, and then I, bought a zillion things because I put it up to their thumb. So, I mean, there's certainly problems with it.
You get into consent problems there,
yeah.
right? You got consent problems.
Face IDs are a little better in that they if you close the eyes, it won't scan. Assuming that the eyes are open and the person is really there in its presence and there's consent. So.
My problem with the facial recognition stuff is that and I'm a white dude, so I can say this, a bunch of white dudes in Silicon Valley write that stuff, and they're not exactly multicultural in the way that that's been implemented, right? And so you see situations in ethnic diversity where that starts to fail tremendously.
Sure.
So it works great if you're a white dude, but not so much if you're not. So,
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your questions. Yeah, we got one here and then over. Oh, you want to go first?
SMS is not really very secure, right? SS7's got all kinds of problems and so forth. Do you have any kind of metrics or thoughts around, we try to push our users towards MFA apps instead of using SMS because of how bad SMS is, but what's actually more at risk, SMS or the MFA apps, if you had to think between the two?
I would say SMS is worse. I mean, because you mentioned, all the back-end vulnerabilities. I mean, SMS was never meant to be secure for starters. I mean, it's certainly, I guess, kind of apples and oranges, but I would say SMS is worse.
And I would first go back and, did he sit down? There you are, okay. So I would first come back and say, what's our threat model and what are we protecting, right? Am I trying to protect a banking app? SMS sucks, right? Or am I trying to prevent the use of a Yelp discount code, right, to get a free meal somewhere, right? Two different things. SMS could be okay for the free meal code, not okay for my banking transaction. So it really depends on the threat model. But here, you've got a question.
Yeah. Don't we have to listen to him?
Oh, sorry, we're over. Okay, for questions, we can head outside. Thank you for your time and attention. Yep. Have a great rest of the conference.
Thank you.